Congresswoman Marilyn Strickland was born in Seoul to an African-American father and Korean mother who met in the aftermath of the Korean War. As a young child, she was continuously reminded of the hardship minorities in America face. But her parents taught her to work hard, fight for what's right, serve the community, and to stand up for the underdog. In fact, when Strickland was sworn into Congress as one of the first Korean American women members, she famously wore a traditional Korean hanbok in honor of her mother. Representative Strickland serves as a member of the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, in addition to the House Armed Services Committee. She is also a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, the Congressional Asia-Pacific American Caucus, and the bipartisan Historically Black Colleges and Universities Caucus.
I think our challenge here is going to be helping people understand that when we talk about racial equity, this is not a zero-sum game. When we address racial disparities, it uplifts everyone, and that's good for the entire country.
Congressman Andy Kim was born in Boston, Massachusetts, to Korean immigrant parents. He's a Rhodes Scholar, a Truman Scholar, as well as a PhD graduate of Oxford University in England. He became the first Korean American congressman from New Jersey by defeating two-term incumbent Republican Tom MacArthur in the 2018 elections. Kim's 2020 victory made him the first Democrat to win a second term in his district since the Civil War. Andy Kim has been a tireless advocate for not just only Korean Americans, but for Asian Americans too. Through our In Our Hands Political Action Committee, he is fostering the next generation of AAPI leaders in government and raising awareness about the importance of political participation in solving the issues that impact our community. Representative Kim participated in KACF's K-Coalition Virtual Vigil. He's a member of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus and a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the House Small Business Committee.
That's why, you see me get emotional when I talk about my kids, is that the work that I do in Congress, this isn't just about laws and that we're writing and words on a piece of page or speeches that I give. I see this as my way of being a dad and trying to shape the world that they grow up into, whether that's about healthcare or climate change or about racism in our nation. So this is all deeply personal to me. And that is where I draw my strength from. That is my North Star.
I'm just so pleased to be your host for today's conversation. Before we begin, I want to congratulate U.S. Representatives Marilyn Strickland and Andy Kim on being recognized with the KACF-SF's Distinguished Community Leadership Award. And I also want to thank Daniel Dae Kim for joining us today as our special guest participant. So let's go ahead and welcome our guests up to the virtual stage. So we're here today in the midst of rising anti-Asian hate, a hunger for greater visibility, and our need to lift each other up together, not just the Korean American community, but in collaboration with other communities as well. And I know the audience here is really wanting and yearning to hear from all of you, amazing role models, what we can do. They're all ready to go and they want to know what we can do in order to actualize all the energy that has happened over the last couple of years. But I thought it would really be a good thing for us to start with them to get to know you a little bit first, and then we'll go on to the activism part, if that's okay with you all.
Mm-hmm. Sounds great.
Right. So it's great to have you here. So first, I want to start off with the idea of Koreanness. And I want to do it with you as our incredible role models. Andy, like me, you were born in the United States. Marilyn and Daniel, you were born in Korea, and then you came to the United States when you were very young. We all grew up in different parts of the country, but we all had to figure out how being Korean fit into our lives. And my guess is that it happened at different times. And so I think it would be really nice for the audience to hear, how your Korean identity shaped you into the person you are today. And was there a defining event in your childhood or as a young adult? So Andy, why don't we start with you first?
Yeah, well, thank you. And I'm glad to be a part of this, and so great to see Marilyn and Daniel. For me, I feel like I first came to understand being Korean by what it wasn't. I grew up in a predominantly white community, and where the major issue about race was, about being white or being black. And, I think I just felt like I wasn't part of the racial equation. I didn't know where I belonged. And I think I just, felt like I was on the sidelines on that. So I kind of initially came to understand it in sort of a just an absence kind of way. But, I belonged to a Korean American church. That was certainly one of the earliest identities about it. But I'll be honest, I feel like my understanding of being Korean American, Asian American was very ill-defined growing up. I sort of saw it as sort of just like a box to check. It wasn't until I was much older and I got to go to Korea and got to go with my mom. And she took me to where she grew up and she showed me her house, which was at that point just literally a pile of wood and rubble up in the mountains. That's when it really just hit me that I'm just one generation away from this, and that this is where I was connected. And it wasn't until I was literally standing on that rubble, my mom pointing, that part of the rubble was my room, that part of the rubble was our kitchen, that I really came to understand this. So that was kind of my story.
Okay, great. Thank you. Marilyn, I note that you wore a hanbok at your swearing in 2018. So clearly being Korean has been a very important part of you. Can you tell us how that came to be and how it shaped you?
Well, my story is a little different because I am biracial, or I'm Blasian. So I'm half Black and half Korean. And I was born in Seoul, and our family moved to the United States when I was a baby. And we landed in Virginia in the 60s. And I often tell the story of my father wearing his army uniform, my mother wearing a dress and being a baby. And my mother tells me this story. And they drove around all night because they couldn't find a motel room. And finally, someone was willing to rent a motel room to them. And in the conversation about, quote, Koreanness, I often say that if you are raised by a Korean woman, you are Korean. And I think about the fact that, during the time when I grew up, there was a lot of conversation about assimilation. My mother's friends all took American names, but my mother, in her very predictable militant way, refused to take an American name. And so for me, the whole conversation about Koreanness is something that was more private, right? Very obvious at home with the food we ate, with, the habits we had, and even, having my mom sing arirang to me or san toki toki ya, very, very, very traditional things that, young Korean kids do. But I think about that moment when that identity just really came full bloom. And I think about the first time I ran for city council back in 2007 and how it brought together people from all walks of life. And that identity of being Korean was just amplified because there was so much pride in the Korean community that I was going to be the first. And then I was elected mayor as the first. And then I went to Congress as the first. And that's really what inspired me to wear hanbok on the House floor when I was sworn in this past January, to send a message to my mother so she could see me on television and to remind the world that the U.S. House of Representatives is the people's house. It belongs to all of us.
Okay. Daniel, what about you?
We all just want to make our parents proud, don't we?
Indeed.
Hearing Marilyn and Andy's comments jogs a few memories for me. And I would say that the times that I was really most aware of my Koreanness, well, actually, the real answer is, when was I not aware of my Koreanness? Because it's something that you're constantly faced with, quite literally, when you're looking in the mirror and you don't look the same as everyone else around you in your community if you grow up in America. And I grew up like Andy. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania. And it was, there were very few Asian folks. And so, one of my strongest memories was coming home every day, even in elementary school. And I started to realize, very quickly, that our home was kind of a hermetically sealed island in this city of non-Asian people. There was a certain way that I was expected to behave when I was outside my home, and another way, a way I was supposed to behave inside my home. There were almost different rules for our family and interacting with others. And so that kind of that code switching element started being introduced really early. You know, there's certain standards for us, certain food for us that people wouldn't understand. And, you know, for a young kid who was trying to assimilate and kind of just be accepted, it took a while to understand the rules of how it all operated. And for me, I think it's been a journey of acceptance. You know, we're defined by our appearance, as Marilyn was alluding to. You know, and you know, I think it's ironic that I ended up choosing a profession that is also defined by appearance. You know, as are our politicians. I mean, it's a package that people vote for and have to identify with, and so you know, it just highlights how significant the achievements are of people like Andy and Marilyn, that they've been able to represent districts that aren't overwhelmingly Asian, and so it's a significant achievement. I guess the other thing I would say about my Koreanness is, you know, having grown up in a town that didn't have many Asian faces around, you know, I had a similar experience when I went back to Korea as a teenager. I went back for one of those university programs that encourage gyopos, or Koreans who are raised abroad, to come back and experience Korea, learn the language and the culture. For us, for me as a teenager, it was an excuse to party and get to meet other Koreans. But you know, as frustrating as that might have been to my parents, it was actually really a significant experience for me, because I had not been around Koreans like me ever, and I found a community you know, with it, among whom I have friends to this day. And I went as a teenager, but it was so meaningful to share experiences and find people with whom I had a shorthand about what it was like for them to grow up in America, and it bonded us so quickly. And it's no coincidence that that's also where I met my wife, the woman who ended up becoming my wife. So it was very meaningful that summer.
So, you know, I'm sure there are a lot of people in the audience who can relate to that experience in going to Korea. And we just talked about the richness of us, of the idea of us being different and experiencing what others perhaps in the majority or in middle America cannot. But yet there's kind of an opposite piece of that, right? And the negative piece of that is us all experiencing some form of racism and stereotyping. I think, you know, particularly in the communities that we all lived in. So, Daniel, let's start off with you on this. I mean, Hollywood is notorious for typecasting actors, right? You early on broke the mold and played very strong and positive leading roles. But, you know, breaking out, as everyone will attest to, is never easy. People are telling you something that you necessarily don't want to hear. Was there a specific instance that affected you in a particularly difficult way?
I can tell you that most people would think that those kinds of challenges would have existed in the beginning of my career, and predominantly only then. But I can tell you that to this day, almost literally to this day, I have experiences where my ethnicity affects the roles that I play, the amounts of money that I get paid, and the kinds of opportunities that are available to me. Because I like to think that I'm still climbing in my career. And so as I try to reach higher, the opportunities, you know, I get a little bit choosier, and those opportunities are fewer. So you're fighting even harder to get those roles that you feel that you're passionate about and connected to, and to fight in those spaces, you really do see the way that it's, and this phrase gets thrown around a lot, but the system is geared against having people who look like us play heroes or leading men, romantic leading men. And you know, I would say that there's been a lot of progress that we've made in terms of supporting characters, and you see Asian faces populating certain TV shows, but how many do you see leading? And so this is something that I would love to see become normalized, and not just for Asian Americans, but for all people of color and all dispositions. There are a lot of different stories out there to tell. Right now, I mean, up until very recently, we've focused very specifically on white stories and white male stories, and I think it's important that we create those stories where where people who look like us are front and center. So it's a multi-headed hydra, and you have to attack it, I think, this issue from all different angles. Representation, like for instance, when you think of a politician in the United States, is the first person you think of someone that looks like Andy or Marilyn, and we have to change those perceptions. And part of the way we do that is by actually pursuing those professions and actually populating them and making an impact in those ways. And I'm sure you're going to get to that question later, so I don't want to jump the gun or monopolize the time. So thank you.
Okay. So Marilyn, as a woman, as African American, as a Korean American in local politics and later national politics, you are a stereotype smasher as well. And I'm sure there is a story of racism or prejudice. Can you share that with us as well?
Yeah, thank you for this question, because, often when we talk about racism and prejudice, especially in the United States, we think it wears a hood and a robe and burns a cross. And it can be anywhere. It can be subtle, and it can either happen with people who we think are our allies, whether it's intentional or not. And so as I think about some of the different experiences that I've had, I think about being in 5th grade and having dinner at one of my friends' homes, and the father and the brother start using the N-word like it's nothing. I pretended I got sick and had to leave. I remember being in high school, and it was like, high school girls being high school girls, and I would get prank phone calls, and someone would leave messages with my mom or even to me and hang up, and they'd say, you pick a derogatory term for someone who's Asian but not Korean, right? So this, and this. And then I even think about the fact that, every time I have run for office, someone has tried to talk me out of it because there was no way I was going to win. And you layer racism, you layer sexism on there, and all the different ways that people kind of think about women and women of color, right? Think about the stereotypes that people have. There's the submissive Asian flower. There's the fiery Latina. There's the hypersexual Black woman. And so you just roll those stereotypes into what people perceive. And, it put me in a very, very odd position. Now, I've overcome all those things. But when I think about the conversation about racism, it just comes in so many different forms. And I'm not saying that, as a woman of color, that I have to, be hypersensitive and speak out every time it happens. But people need to be called out for it, because if we don't speak up, these things will continue. And sometimes the worst kind of racism happens with people who would never consider themselves racist.
So Andy, you and I have already talked about this in other occasions, but one experience that hit home for me was the story you talk about at the State Department, and sort of the stereotyping there. I mean, can you tell us about that? And if there's something else that you want to relate, please do so.
Yeah, happy to share that story, and it's one that I honestly didn't talk very much about until this year. But when I was at the State Department almost 10 years ago, I just gotten back from Afghanistan, worked for my country in a war zone, put my life on the line. And I came back and I was working at the State Department in DC, and I found a letter at work one day on my top of my keyboard. And I remember opening it, and I started reading it, and my jaw just dropped, because the letter was informing me that I was banned from working on issues related to Korea. And I didn't understand where it was coming from. I was not applying for a job to work on Korea issues, and I'd already gone through multiple security backgrounds, as anyone there at State Department does. So it just was it was so disrespectful that, like, while I was serving my country in Afghanistan, while I was putting my life on the line, I have top secret security clearance. While I was doing all that, my country, for some reason, was proactively investigating me, unprompted, at least as far as I know. And, it just was this sense that, that I just couldn't shake my last name, that I happen to have a last name of a axis to evil dictator. And, and in foreign policy, it's just this idea that, therefore there's just some suspicion that comes with this. And it was just, it made me feel like that I wasn't 100% American, that I wasn't 100% a State Department officer, that I could not do 100% of the things out there. I could only do 80% of it. And it got to the point where, it almost made me want to leave. And it almost means like, I wanted them to just give me an explanation and to apologize. And I have to say, I'm in Congress now, and I'm on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I now have oversight over this. So I'm trying to get this fixed because it's not just me; it's others.
Did you get an apology? Did they give you an explanation? No?
Never. No. I mean, in fact, I was told that I can't appeal it unless I actually was applying for a job on Korea.
Right.
So like I couldn't actually appeal. And as I raised it to bosses of mine, I was told, you know what, if you don't want a job on Korea issues, then just let it be. That's literally what they would say. Mm-hmm. And I hate to say it, but part of me, did just kind of say like, okay, look, I'm just going to kind of grind it out. And that's what I feel bad about looking in hindsight, is that I felt like the power wasn't on my side. I felt like no one would listen to me if I raised it. So why bother? And that kind of apathy mixed with these issues, I think, is something a lot of us have felt, where, we've had an incident where we look back on it. Even just recently, not recent, at the beginning of the pandemic, I had an incident where I was on a train and I sat down next to a woman who saw that I was Asian American, just started yelling at me, telling me to get away from her because, she thought she was going to get COVID from me. And I wish I could tell you that I said the right things and I confronted her and it was a learning moment, but I moved because I wanted to avoid a conflict in a public space. And I don't know about you, but I replay those incidences in my mind constantly. And I constantly wonder, like, what were the right words for me to say to her? What could have gotten through? What should I have said to the State Department? And so I use those as learning experiences, trying to train me for the next time to just, be better. But I still carry that weight and that baggage, as I'm sure, Daniel and Marilyn have similar type episodes that, sometimes you just can't get past.
So that actually is a good sort of segue into this whole notion, and I think the audience wants to hear about taking action. The past 2 years, for a variety of reasons, have been incredibly difficult and violent for people of color. Yet, we've had COVID, the economy, how it affects underserved communities. And yet out of that came Black Lives Matter and the mobilization of the Asian American community against anti-Asian hate. And I guess, if nothing else, the past 2 years were really about, they made clear that words matter. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, Marilyn, let's ask you, what's your reaction to that? I mean, what is it that you think we should be doing in terms of taking action? I mean, in terms of the collectively and politically.
Well, I would say that as Asian Americans, and even leaning in on being Korean American, is that we have not historically been encouraged to be vocal. And part of that is cultural, and part of it is just the expectations that people have put on us. But I believe that, having to live through the last administration and then what happened with Black Lives Matter, with stopping Asian hate, we definitely, I think, have found our voice in a different way and are now taking action. And I think the question for me is, we have to sustain this work, right? We have to continue to be active. I remember when Black Lives Matter was happening, I would see on social media that said Koreans for Black Lives, Asian Americans for Black Lives. And so there's an opportunity for us to build bridges or mend fences in places where historically there's this idea that we were not together. And a lot, and I think about sometimes when different ethnic groups are divided, and sometimes, that is just white supremacy trying to separate us. And other times it's, there are some issues that have taken place historically, but how do we come together and think about how we work together and find out what we have in common? I think that's one thing that's important. I remember the tragic spa murders that took place in Atlanta. I remember that happened in the evening, and the next day we were going to we were going to renew the Violence Against Women Act. And I remember, my chief of staff and I, Andrew Doe, who's also Korean, said, you have to get on the floor and make a speech. I'm like, you're right. And so I made a 1-minute speech and I called it out for what it was. I said, it's not economic anxiety. It's not someone who has a sex addiction. I said, this is straight up racism. And calling that out, I think, was very, very important for me as a woman of color, and as a Korean American woman, because a lot of Korean women were part of that massacre. So as we think about, using our voice, it's just having the courage to speak up often when people don't expect us to, but also sustaining that work to think about how do we pass policies that are going to address some of these things, and how do we not do what I say America does very well, to my chagrin. It's like, we have a very short attention span. We have to continue to do this work and sustain it so that we're able to address some of these issues.
Okay, so Daniel, I want to ask you about the role of popular media, and Andy alluded to this a little bit too. The idea of foreignness as it applies to Korean Americans and Asians generally. It's, again, as Andy talked about, it's the notion that Asian Americans are not real Americans. And you've been particularly outspoken and are involved in a number of organizations that are looking to explicitly change this narrative. Can you tell us what you're doing and why you felt this was important?
Well, I think, being in the industry that I'm in, I understand and recognize the power of media. And I see the ways that we've been represented on television. And very often, especially for young children, this is the first exposure they would have to anyone who looks like us. And so, when I was growing up and I didn't see that many people who looked like me, it became subconsciously acceptable to not have us included. And, we began, I'll speak for myself, I began to identify with people who did not look like me. My favorite TV characters were not necessarily Asian ones. And I think that's something that media does in an active way and in a passive way. It is in a way a passive value delivery system. So what we see can actually determine how we feel about a certain ethnic group or sexual disposition or religion. And so we have to be, I think, very mindful of what we choose, how we choose to portray everyone on television. And that is not to say that Asian people can only be portrayed as heroes. It's really just about portraying the full spectrum of humanity, so that we cannot be pigeonholed into one thing or stereotyped and easily dismissed as this or not thought of as a congressperson. So things like that, I think, are incredibly important. And, I think there's more of a consciousness about it now, but it's not about being colorblind, which so many people have said. It's really the opposite. It's about being color conscious and trying to overturn those stereotypes that all of us have been subjected to create a new perception of the fullness of who we are.
So that's great. I mean, you're talking about images, and when we were also earlier, we were talking about words. And Andy, I forgot. I wanted to ask you specifically about a story that I think holds, that is, very, just so poignant about your son and the impact of words and, for that matter, images, which Daniel was alluding to. Can you tell us what happened and how that affected you?
I think you're talking probably about the incidents that my son had earlier this year, where one day he came home from school one day and he kind of came up to me and he was like, Dad, has something happened at school, and he doesn't normally kind of frame things in that way. So I asked him what happened. He told me that a bigger kid kept calling him Chinese boy over and over again. And my son, being the cute kid that he is, he said back, "No, I'm a New Jersey boy." So I'm proud of him for standing up in that way. But I could tell it really bothered him. And in fact, kind of like what I was saying earlier, when you were replaying something in your mind, I thought it was particularly powerful that later on in the evening he recanted and retold that story to my wife. So it was clear that it was just still on his mind, and he was still replaying that. And honestly, it's something that reminded me of what I believe to be the first instance of racism that I experienced when I was around his age, where I remember it was an instance where I could overhear several other boys talking about me and talking about my race and how I look different. And it wasn't them specifically talking to me, but they were talking loud enough to know that I heard them. And, I think that really fits in with a lot of these other issues that we're talking about, because not only was it an otherization that was happening to me, but it was also a sense of belonging. The fact that I was not even talked to, they had their circle amongst themselves and I was on the outside, it kind of framed it. So when I heard my son have that instance, it immediately, triggered in me, just this flood of emotions that I felt. And I'll be honest with you, I felt frustrated that I was not better prepared for that moment. I did not know what to say to him. I didn't actually, really think through this in a way beforehand to have that right word for him. So, I have started to engage with him on this, process of understanding his Korean heritage and coming at it from a source of pride, of coming at it from an understanding of preparedness about what might happen. But also the way I sort of describe it is I also want him to not only worry about the discrimination geared and faced by people who look like us, but I want him to be considerate and understanding about just the discrimination that others will face as well. And I also have to keep in mind, I cannot discount the fact that I need to make sure that he doesn't become a source of some of that as well. We have to check our own privileges and biases. So that's been a kind of a real challenge as a father, to kind of go through this while, Marilyn and me and Daniel and others are trying to do this on a bigger societal level. We also have to think about just how we do it personally and individually. And sometimes those are some of the harder ones to do. Sometimes it's easier for me to give a speech about this than it is to talk to my 5-year-old son about this. And that's a very, humbling experience.
So that then leads to, I think, what a lot of people in our audience, about kids and our children and inspiring the next generation, and helping our community to be productive and part of America as we are. There's little awareness and very little funding to support critical Asian American issues. I mean, KACF-SF, KACF does these kinds of things, and gives money towards pressing issues. For example, many people may not be aware that poverty is a huge problem for Korean American seniors. And so when we look at the context of all these different things that are going on with our communities and how we might be able to help at different levels, you at a very societal level, us at one-on-one kind of interactions, what can we do to inspire the next generation of civic-minded leaders? How can we get them to act? And what advice would you give them in terms of those who want to go into career public service? So Marilyn, maybe I'll ask you, you're agreeing with me on this.
I think about the way that America thinks about Korean Americans, and there are probably some mileposts that some folks in a generation have. So people think about the TV show MASH, and for a lot of people, they don't think that Korea even existed before that period in history. And then they think about the Olympics, and then they think about the World Cup, and then there are these markers. Now it's K-pop, now it's K-drama, now it's all these things. And I sometimes jokingly say that Korean is the new Black. But as we think about what's important to inspire people, I think it comes down to helping people understand that everything that happens in politics is relevant to your daily life. And I think about the example that Daniel talked about, and even Andy talking about invisibility, right? You didn't see yourself on television, so you didn't think of yourself as a leading man. You didn't see yourself when those boys were talking about you, Andy, so you were invisible. So we have to stop being invisible, because if we allow that to happen, then we will remain invisible. I think about a data point that Asian Americans represent the fastest growing group of voters right now. Georgia flipped from red to blue, and the Asian American population, especially Korean Americans in Gwinnett County, had a big hand in that. And so how you get involved doesn't necessarily have to be in one lane. You can run for office, you can work on a campaign, you can work for someone who's a member of Congress, you can be a staffer for one of the many committees that happen. But it's just finding that place and understanding that whether it's local office, state office, or federal office, the work that we do as elected officials has an impact on everyone's daily life. And in many ways, there's a responsibility we have to step up.
Daniel, thoughts?
First of all, amen to everything that Marilyn just said. I agree with all of it, and it's very well put. And I would kind of just drill down a little bit on one of the points she made, and that is to define your sphere of influence. we may not be we now are not politicians or have a platform like an actor or a musician or a major athlete, but we all have a group of friends, colleagues at work, who look to us and our opinions and who we are. That is our sphere of influence. And so once we do that, maybe we can do one thing. All of us can do one thing in that sphere of influence to change the people that we can, or educate the people that we can, to as to our opinions, our feelings, our situations. Because one of the things that is a common thread through a lot of this conversation is our desire to speak up and our not being present enough in that moment to speak. I mean, Andy, you spoke of it in your story. And I think it's one of those things that is hardest the first time, right? And once you do start speaking up, each time it gets a little bit easier. And so, how many times at cocktail conversations have we heard uncomfortable things, but not spoken up for what was right? And we just let it pass saying, it's a cocktail conversation. But once you do it, it's not a crime to let people know where you stand and say, I'm against racism. I'm against violence against Asian American people. And that is just speaking your truth. And to be able to do that with the people around you who do care about you is an important step, whether it's posting something on social media so everyone who follows you knows that you care about this issue, or at a cocktail conversation when there's something passively slipped in that's racist, just to not let it slip by, not necessarily make a huge deal about it, but to let your opinion be known so that it changes the course of the conversation. These are small ways that we can speak up if you don't have the platforms that a politician does or someone like me does. Yes. So find whatever it is that you can do and do it.
Mm-hmm.
You're muted, Philip.
Andy, what kind of advice would you give to younger folks?
Yeah, so definitely snaps to what Marilyn and Daniel said. I won't repeat that, but let me kind of add another element to it. When I think about what my theory of change is in terms of the change that I want to see happen, the way I sort of describe it is that the change is not going to occur quickly, and it's also not going to occur just by mobilizing the Korean American community alone.
Mm-hmm.
So, when I think about that, I always think about how do you sustain? So yes, we've had a tremendous amount of energy and focus and attention in this country this year, perhaps the largest during my lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're constantly trying to build off of the energy and attention after tragedies and after incidents like that, you're not going to be able to sustain it. We need to find a way to mobilize beyond headlines and be able to understand how it is that you can create that kind of higher baseline of engagement. So that's one aspect of it. And that requires infrastructure. That requires social groups, communities. Yeah. It requires, Daniel and I, we've been engaged on a lot of these talks about how do you build that across different sectors and different industries. So that's one thing. The second thing is I really don't think, we really need to think about coalition building, and that's a word, coalition is a word that I use with, the work that I did as a diplomat or anything else. I don't think you can get anything done in this era, especially in such a diverse country like ours, unless you build coalitions. And you have to be thoughtful about this, and you have to recognize if you want someone to be there for you, you better be there for them.
That's right.
And you got to be thinking about that in a very real way, in a way that is not just transactional, but is based off of something deeper. And the more that we can frame ourselves in that direction, I think the greater success that we will have. So, to what Marilyn was saying earlier, when there was the March for Black Lives, are you there? Are you there? Are you present? Are you an ally? Are you someone that's going to be connecting on that level? And then it's up to us to explain and to showcase why it is that we need other people to come to our efforts and to be able to mobilize in that way. So those are the two things in particular: coalition building with others, as well as sustainment of the attention and the energy going forward.
Okay, so we're going to have to wrap up now. As much as I would love to continue the conversation, and I know that folks, we have a chat function that you can exchange ideas as we go through this as well. But I'd like, we've got about 30 seconds for each of you. So I want to end with this. What are the 2 takeaways you would like our audience to keep with them after they've had this program with you and they've heard from you? What are the 2 things you want them to make sure that they don't forget? And Daniel, why don't you go ahead?
I would say, as Asian Americans, we must stop underestimating ourselves. We have to stop thinking, well, we're visitors in this country. We're not real Americans. Because as much as we take issue with people saying that about us, especially the first generation immigrant mentality is one where we should not expect anything from this country. We should just go along to get along. And we deserve and we've earned more than that. So we shouldn't underestimate our power. The second thing is, once you've not underestimated your power, what are you going to do about it? 23 million people in this country and growing, as Marilyn said. We are a force, whether we recognize it or not. And how are we going to be a part of the solution of bringing equality, justice, not just to our community, and as Andy so rightfully alluded to, but to the problem of systemic racism in general, because we are all in this together. And I don't think any of us here are saying, Asians are superior to anyone else. What we are saying is that we are all equal together. We're all in this together. And so to be able to reach out, to use the power that we've earned as a demographic and individually, our earning power is something that we should use and use wisely.
Okay, Andy, 2 takeaways.
Yeah, I think I'd start with saying, we cannot assume that someone else will fight our fights for us, and we cannot assume that we're going to be on the right side of history in that kind of way. Marilyn and I, every day we see how we need to push the Biden administration. We have to push others to be, taking this account. Daniel came and testified to make sure that, people here are understanding it. I have a Democratic member, I'm not going to say who it is, who came up to me and was like, oh, this is crazy what's happening to Asian Americans in this country. But look, the pandemic's almost over, so you'll be okay. And this was a Democrat member of Congress,
Wow.
So it shows that we cannot take anything for granted, and we can't assume that other people will do the right thing for us. So let's keep at it. And the other thing that I'll just say is that some of that is going to require us to, some of it might be a little uncomfortable, put ourselves in situations where we're not talking to an audience that is already jazzed about what we have to say. I say that as someone who's a Democrat. I'm one of only 7 Democrats left in the country that represents the district Trump won. My district is 85% white, less than 3% Asian American. And a lot of people certainly didn't think I could win this district. And I remember, an Asian American group talking about the mobilizing roundtables and talks about, being Asian American. And I said, well, why don't you come to my district? We can have. And they're like, oh, well, you don't have very many Asian Americans there. I'm like, that's exactly why they need to have that conversation here. So let's not just go the path of least resistance and speak to audiences only where we know that they're going to be on board. Let's try to find some ways to be able to to push out that boundary and put ourselves sometimes in a little bit more of a tighter situation. But that's where a lot of the excitement can actually happen.
Marilyn, you've got the last word.
So I'm going to build on what Andy said. And often when you're a person of color and you're the only one in the room, you don't want to be that minority. Don't be afraid to be that minority and speak up, especially when you are outnumbered dramatically. I think that's one thing. And number 2, I have to get political here. Every time there is an open seat for office, whether it's school board, city council, the mayor's office, state legislature, governor's office, Congress, we have to field credible candidates who can compete and win. We have to be present, and we can't have these giant gaps in representation. I've said this to my African American community. We have to be present. And so let's just make sure that we are building a bench for the future so that we don't have to keep having conversations about where's our representation. It should be standard.
Okay. So thank you, Congresswoman Marilyn Strickland, Congressman Andy Kim, and Daniel Dae Kim. Thank you so much for sharing your personal stories with us. Thank you for being amazing role models. And thank you for inspiring us. We need you. Best wishes. And thank you very much.